call this meeting to order. And so we're going to move forward with our workshop today. On the agenda is the continuing conversation around our educational planning. This is ongoing work. We're going to have the workshop today. We also have a work session coming up in June. But we promised the board and Dr. Boone shared with us that she would be bringing back to us continuous updates, and that's part of what we're doing today. So with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Boone.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Mr. Jordan said, we'll have additional discussions with cooperative strategists as we think about our educational planning. And in a lot of ways, this work is paralleling the length of time it takes for us to deal with budget. So it never stops. It continues to go on and on. And so today there are just a few items we want to update the board on, one that we want to do a little deeper dive into. And so that's some of the work that's going on that we'll have. And we posted a presentation about transportation, and this links to staggers and how that deals with our current pathways and everything. Talk just briefly about the Camp Allen Sewell's Point discussion and where that goes. The Maury Ed Spec meeting last week, just an update of how that played out, and then talk some about what we can anticipate coming forward in June, and that big picture. So that's what we've scheduled to talk about probably for the next 40 minutes, and so. With that, Tracy, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I will start. Let me start with Camp Allen Sewell's Point, if I can, because I think that's just a short discussion that we'll have on this one. What we have done is we have re-geocoded the students' current enrollment. Dennis has sent us all that information so we could geocode to the current student enrollment. And on Tuesday, we're going to present to the DLT if there's any changes to the recommendation of the boundary that we anticipate changing when the school gets completed and the implementation for it. It doesn't look like there's much of a change. I mean, we noticed the increased enrollment, but as the boundaries go, it'll be difficult to switch boundaries without kind of breaking up neighborhoods so much. So we're just going to have to look at the fall count once again just to be sure, but we're going to bring to you a recommendation with the final boundary in June that we're going to recommend for that. So that's where we are in that, but we're going to present that to the DLT to make sure that we've got questions with them before we bring it to the board.
Okay.
So are there any questions on Camp Allen Sewell's Point?
No, sir. You may continue.
Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation. I've got a presentation I made to the DLT on May 8th that I want to share with you that, you know, when we started to go down a lot of the planning routes and especially starting to talk about some grade configuration changes and as we move forward on that, a little birdie in my ear kept yelling at me that, hey, that's going to add a lot of school buses, a lot of school buses, and you know, Mr. Bob Kleinbell, who I've come to much appreciate his position and the position of his staff and what they have to go through on a daily basis to make sure that, you know, students are transported to school safely and on time. It's a complicated system, but what we figured out was that we have to do some extensive reviews to make sure that when we make facility decisions that, although there are several factors that we got to include here, is that we don't jeopardize, you know, budget, time, educational process, any of that, because of this. And so it took us down the road a little bit of a discussion regarding a more efficient and more effective yellow bus school transportation system. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen really quick with you, and I'm going to do a short PowerPoint to kind of take you through. And just let me know if you can see this. It comes on the screen. You see that?
Tell her not yet. He can't hear us, can
Not yet.
Okay, hold on. Let me go share my. I heard something.
It's coming.
Okay.
Got it?
No, we got the second screen, but we don't have the presentation on it yet.
The windows.
Yeah, there it is.
Did you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And we have hard copies of the presentation.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let me go through here. So notice I put draft on this because we're still doing some exploration of cost savings, and it takes a while to go through a lot of this stuff. So I want to make sure that this is still very much a process that we're doing a deeper dive on some of these areas, but I'll let you know where those are. But what we want to do is review the current yellow bus transportation model, explore some alternative models that then create some options and outline the benefits and challenges of options that make the alternative options better than the current model. Define the process of change, and then eventually come up with those implementation strategies. The first thing that we note is that there's nothing that we can do for the 2018-19 school year necessarily that have monumental changes in them. Obviously, the Transportation Department works through as many efficiencies as they can, but the major changes wouldn't be able to happen until the actual 1920 school year. But that fits into good protocol of community engagement and community education if changes were to be made. So looking at the current stagger system, it's a four-stagger system. And what you note in this is that, and I can point out some of these things, but what happens is that the longest routes and the longest mileage routes and the longest time routes are the first staggered routes in the morning and then get first picked up. Well, what happens in this scenario is that in this route right here, in the first routes, we have routes of up to 120 minutes. Many of you know there are children being picked up, high school students being picked up at 5:30 in the morning to be transported across the city to get to their schools. But what happens in these staggers is because of the start times in here, that at 120 minutes, we can't use a lot of these buses until the fourth stagger, because these end up being somewhere in that 30 to 40 minute stagger, and at 120 minutes, you'll never make the first two staggers. And so there's some huge inefficiencies in the fact that that we can't even use the buses we have or the resources, the bus drivers that we have into the fourth stagger. And so what ends up happening is that some of those intermediate routes that can't make the first stagger and barely make the third are either late for the third stagger pickup or they are sitting in order to make the fourth stagger. And so on top of that, you see the first two staggers use the most buses and most resources, and the last stagger then uses the least. So it occurred to me that as I start to look at this, that we uncovered some options around this to figure out how we could start to make some improvements on this. But the challenges that happen, again, they're just some repeat of these, is that the early high school pickup is getting picked up at 5:30 in the morning to get on a bus poses all kinds of things that just don't go to the value of educational benefit. Long bus rides, that early morning, late night, really adds to the complications of the everyday school life of a high school kid. The route times and staggers cause late bus arrivals consistently, driver downtimes, and so trying to get bus drivers that come in. Now, the board has made just an awesome recommendation to increase the pay to make NPS the highest bus driving paid in the new contract year. But what happens in that time is that the other part is that trying to get the hours the bus driver needs in order to make an attractive position it isn't very attractive when I get a 2-hour shift here and a 2-hour shift in the afternoon, and I can only really work 4 of the 6 hours. Or I have a bus driver that is sitting for an hour in between or bus routes. And so what this does then is it requires more bus drivers. And so, we can't fill every bus driving contract we have already. Maybe one of the toughest positions to hire in a school division is a bus driver. The real hardest one is a substitute bus driver. Very difficult to find. And so, when you've got these kind of challenges, even though the pay scale is good, the benefits of the bus driver and why people become bus drivers a lot of times is because it's got some flexibility in their day. And when we don't provide that flexibility, that causes a strain on that. The other challenges are activity buses. Between athletics and specialty day programs is that we have like the Nauticus program that really does require 2 buses, and they do run 2 buses, but the second bus is consistently late. And the reason for that is because we don't have the buses because they're in those long routes in the day to provide enough. And so, and with athletics, the idea of being able to transport, especially from the middle school programs, the citywide programs, into their neighborhood middle schools, that becomes a challenge also because, again, of the amount of bus drivers we need in those staggers to start. And so there's some alignment that has to happen here. And again, my initial thought was, well, this could be fixed by, making the bookending the biggest bus routes. So if I were to take high schools to start and then make my second stagger, my 4th stagger, then I could possibly then make more efficient use of the buses. Well, then I immediately got my hand slapped by every middle school person in the division because this really puts a strain on middle school activities after school because that's the late time. And when you start to think about after-school activities, especially outdoor activities in our middle schools fields aren't equipped for really nighttime activities. And on top of that, we do transport a lot of those students from, the citywide programs into the regular feeder middle schools. So as we started to play with that, we again just increased some of our challenges there. So then it was introduced that maybe we could go to a 3-stagger system. And a 3-stagger system then allows for some equal distribution of buses and equal distribution of drivers. Now with this, and now we're playing with kind of some student hours at the bottom. So if you look, these are really drafting the fact that, trying to get school start time not so early that it hinders, and not making school drop, the start time of each one too late to dismiss. And so what you see here is that there is a switch around to make the elementary then the early stagger and then high school the late stagger. Now what this option doesn't do is it doesn't move the stagger of the middle grades programs at all. And so we don't really have a huge impact on 1/3 of the population that we're going to serve. And so the start times can be adjusted because as I was talking to Mr. Kleinbell and his staff, I was talking about, well, 3:40 dismissal time. If it was 3:30, 3:35, that's a lot better connotation than a 3:40. And so even though it's not a lot of time, when you tell people a 3:30 dismissal, it seems a lot easier than 3:40. I don't know why that is. It just happens to be that way. So what we did was started to see, okay, what are the benefits and challenges of this kind of stagger? Well, the challenges that we face certainly are the changing of schedules. When you start talking about schedule change, I pretty much put it like this. So basically, in a daily transportation, you're going to you transport about 1/3 of your students on a daily basis. 11 or 12,000 students, and so what happens is that there's a 1/3 of people that aren't affected by transportation. So other than the start time, and And so I'm not sure they're really engaged in it, except for the start time of schools. You got a third that you're likely to make angry by doing this, and then there's a third who are going to like it. And that's pretty much the way transportation planning goes. And so when you're starting to talk about changing the schedules, you can expect that there's going to be some community pushback to that. And we expect that everywhere. Because there's going to be discussions around parents at work and work multiple jobs or multiple shifts and doing all that, as far as daycare and all of those things that get associated with the school time. Athletic start times would also be a challenge, and one of the biggest challenges of athletic start times is field lighting. So with a later high school, because we don't necessarily have to mess with the middle school start time, with a later high school start time, obviously athletics would start later. So there was we asked for a quote from a company that does work with the division on lighting, and the estimate was that if we were to do lighting at all the schools for all the fields and activity fields outside, what would that be? And the ranges were basically about $300,000 to $500,000 per high school. Now, we did a little deeper dive on this, though, and we said, okay, so when do we really need lights? And what it was discovered was that there's probably a 6-week period in the year that this would actually impact. And that would be that early spring time when the time hasn't changed yet to allow, an extra hour daylight. And so we actually went back, and I haven't seen it yet, but we went back and asked to see, okay, what would it be to do not permanent lights, but non-permanent lights to rent for 4 to 6 weeks a year at the high schools on the unlimited amount of fields we don't have. And we anticipate that number would be a lot less than the roughly 1.5 to 2.5 million that you would spend on doing athletic field permanent lighting. That, and if we were able to, I'll make the quick jump over to facility planning. If we're able to do facility improvements and capital improvements, such as the CTE school, or the improvements to Maury, whatever the action will be on that, part of the budget will be athletic fields anyway, so that kind of takes it out of that equation. And so we're exploring some different options, but when it comes down to the idea that, athletic start times and not changing that's changing the high school start time because of athletics, because of a 4 to 6 week period on 10% of our athletes, I'm not sure that's a deal breaker. And then the next challenge would be the elementary dismisses earliest. And I think that this goes back in the community pushback. But I think what you find is that a lot of, and I was in this boat too, but as a parent, that the late start time for elementary school typically is a bigger challenge than early dismissal times because of work start times that aren't as flexible as work leave times. And so, and the ability to offer either assisted after-school daycare or through daycare programs or through after-school programs at the elementary grade level, this can be resolved also. So those we see can be some really big challenges. The benefits that we see kind of go down another pathway. The first thing we look at is the full utilization of fleet and drivers and less driver downtime. Now, what that means is that full utilization of fleet means that there's not an inefficiency, which means we actually have potential that the fleet doesn't have to be as big as it does. Now, that being said, again, the city provides Mr. Kleinbell an annual budget for school bus replacement, but at the rate and number of buses that he has, that age of bus is quickly going to rise to an average bus age of 18 to 20 years in the next few years. Typical replacement time is 14 to 16 years on a bus. And so when you start to see those aging buses, what happens is your maintenance costs start to go up. So what we want to do is reduce the number of our fleet if we can. The less driver downtime, again, is a benefit to drivers who really want to get that full-time employment with as much as they can in their hours. The shortened ride times. because of the efficiency in the fleet utilization, we can actually now use buses instead of 120 minutes. We can use those buses to do shorter 40-minute routes. That way they can make every stagger they want to make. And those late time, in this case the high school, which are those long routes, those bus drivers now can have some efficiency to get back to school to be an activities bus because of their short ride times. Now, the other thing is a reduction of approximately 40 contracts. Now, at about $16,500 a year, you can do the math. It's somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 efficiency. Now, that's in the budget. That doesn't mean 40 bus drivers get cut because you can't fill those 40 positions anyway. We just don't need a budget for them anymore. And so there's an annual budget savings when it comes to that. The later AM pickup times, so if you see in the first stagger, all of those are elementary schools. And most elementary school routes are between 15 and 22 minutes, which means very few students, if any, would ever have to be picked up before 7 a.m. And so, which generally during the school year we find light time. So there is a benefit to that because of those shorter route times at the elementary grade level. Then also the later high school start time. There's a lot of research out there that has been going on about high school start time and the later start time. And it is compelling evidence that shows that later start times is a benefit to high school student achievement. And so I think part of this has to be displaying that research-based benefits and showing those research models that are out there that are true longitudinal studies that really show some evidence in that. The evidence does show decreased absenteeism with later high school time, and which again in the Commonwealth with the SOL standards, decreased absenteeism is an accreditation benefit, and so you could lead to more accreditation through that, through just that. Things that you don't see on here programmatically is that you can actually, by later start time, you can increase the capacity of a building. I know that sounds bizarre, but because you have then school time started at 9 o'clock, you could offer 0 periods at school for students who can or want to get an early coursework offering to then reduce their amount of time they need to be in the school all day. So you actually increase your capacity of your building because you can open up a 0 period. And then you can work within, with the teachers, within the CBA to figure out, can we find teachers who want to teach in 0 periods to extend those days and offerings to students. Another benefit is middle school start time is really not impacted by this, so we don't really affect that a whole lot. In this year, you will see, though, that we're going to be proposing a realignment of the citywide middle school programs into schools, which will be more beneficial on transportation, and so we'll have that in here. Which leads me to the activity bus efficiencies. The activity bus, and you got a 4 and 5 activity bus, you may be able to eliminate a lot of the 4 o'clock activity buses and increase, and then show some increase in the 5 o'clock, but not to the extent of the 4 o'clock. That way there's more opportunity for kids to stay after school, to participate, because they will have that 5 o'clock bus and the number of buses needed to transport those students who want to stay after school. So this is the option that we're exploring. We feel like it has the most benefits to it, and we feel like if gone through a process that works through to show the benefits of a 3-stagger system, and not only the economic benefits, but the educational benefits to the division, that we think we can do this. So then there does have to be a cost-benefit analysis. We already can identify in a budget cut of between $400,000 and $500,000 in just bus contracts. That doesn't mean that now that if we can reduce some fleet, we may be able to decrease some mileage on the road, which again just leads to more efficiency. And with the decrease in fleet, the maintenance budget then can stay within reason. Presentation of the school board. We'd like to make a presentation on the 6th with kind of a more in-depth model for you. But if moving forward on this, if we want to engage in a transportation analysis change, I think that we obviously have to go through a community engagement process. So looking at survey methods, how we want to go out to the community, the education model, how we want to educate on best practices and research best practice evidence, and how we want to conduct community meetings throughout the city to make sure that parents do understand and can voice either their concerns or their support for this, for whatever might happen. Again, the established timeline for implementation probably can't happen until the 1920 school year, although I think that we can find some minor efficiencies by realignment of the middle school athletic programs. But again, not a whole lot in the first year that we could see. So with that, do you have any questions?
Well, first, Dr. Boone, anything you want to add before we do that?
Well, I think, again, what you see is the comprehensive approach that we're taking to this process. Heard comments when I was before council, numbers are down, why don't you just close the school? There's a process to how you begin to do that, just as there's a process with transportation. So if we can figure out transportation efficiencies around this work, and then we do the facilities piece paired with that, then we have a make sense model of how we go forward. It's not haphazard, ooh, we forgot about that, and then we go back and tweak something else. We're really trying to look at this in a comprehensive fashion, and so this is a part of that.
Questions, comments, Ms. Basine?
Well, I'm very excited about this prospect. I think it's a move in potentially the right direction. I have a question about, so how does the report or the review being done by the Council of Great City Schools, because I think they were doing a transportation piece as well, right?
Right, they were doing, but they were looking more at our operations outside of the routing.
Okay.
They will have some commentary on how we use routes and assign routes, but they were aware too that we were looking at some of the stagger pieces.
Okay.
What we've seen, heard from them as the verbal debrief when they left is that there are some very clear alignments and relationships between recommendations they will be making and what this happens. And then the rest of that report would be around how the transportation department is organized internally, from mechanics to routing and all of that.
Dr. Gabriel?
Certainly the benefits are very exciting. When we go forth with the community conversations, are we going to try to pair that with the educational planning and the realignment of the feeder patterns when we bring that to the community?
I'll let Tracy share his thoughts on that question.
Boy,
Yeah, because I almost think sometimes we got to do some things together. We got to start with something. If we put, this is me talking, and certainly Tracy does this for a living. If we put too much in the feedback piece, people can get confused.
Right.
So if we talk about school start times and staggers and the financial efficiencies that come along with that, then that makes a great deal of sense. People can grasp on that. The other piece is more about, what does that mean for me and my mindset of where I thought I was going. People become attached to a building, the building versus anything else, And once they're in the building, they get attached to the people, and so nobody ever wants to shift. And so I would think we would have a couple of different opportunities, but Tracy, you tell us your expertise.
Dr. Ben, I think that's right. I think that, there is potential with Dr. Gabriel. I can see the point on some efficiencies of those meetings because we certainly don't want to wear out the community. I mean, that's something that can happen. You can get some fatigue for that, and oftentimes fatigue can lead to some apathy, and we don't want that. And so, however, the other side of that is that if you throw too much at them in this community process, they may lose focus on the importance of each one. to the point where, again, if we were to change a feeder pattern and they come in and they're not happy about that, they may not be able to provide the input we want on transportation, and that information is just as valuable to us. We just may figure out that it's a process that we can do. For instance, we can do some early polling through, pushing out electronic surveys, even talking to some of the community organizations out there to help us in the education model of the transportation. That way we can lessen how much we may have to go out to. And so I think that, Virginia Beach actually just went through this also, that they did a lot of online push-out surveying and really focusing, on targeting groups to make sure that everybody got participation in it to get some really good feedback. And so I think that I don't want to, I'd like to actually do a little deeper dive with Virginia Beach to see how their model of communication was set up, because I think they do it effectively in that model of transportation. I just recently actually heard that they're going to delay theirs for right now, possibly on some community feedback. So I just want to, I think I just need to look at that a little closer to see how we want to deliver it. My initial gut tells me I would separate the conversation, though.
So what I would want to have a better understanding is what are the conversations that we are going to be bringing to the community? What are the separate ones, and then when that's going to happen?
And that's what you will hear some of that as part of the June 6th meeting. What are the conversations that we need to have? What are the timelines associated with those, and when should we space those out for the effectiveness? Mm-hmm. We're going to certainly provide the general thought of that, but again, just so the what is school start times as it relates to this, any boundary and pathway changes, and that's primarily it, right, Tracy?
Yeah, that's the big conversation for
So
the
those
fall.
are two big.
Yeah, it's the realignment of the schools.
Pathways.
Say boundary and pathways, that's that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And honestly, a lot of the pathway discussion, even though we'll start the community conversations next year, not every one of them can be implemented in the 1920 school year. I mean, we are going to have to stagger some of that implementation too, as hopefully some capital dollars come in for capital improvement. So I don't think everything, but I think those are the two primary conversations we're having.
Okay.
I think what you see is that this is not a one-year master plan. This is a multi-year master plan. So we will lay it out and phase it and stage it based on, as Tracy was just saying, there's some capital assumptions that will be part of this in order for us to move the needle.
Ms. Doyle and Dr. Robinson.
When did the busing stagger become part of the educational plan planning?
Well, when we started looking at some of the questions around the specialty school work, how do we support that? And it really emerged too when we were looking at the boundary shifts for the comprehensive CTE high school. That was the nexus, the genesis for us. Separate and apart from that, Ms. Basine had been talking about it, for a couple of years. And you'll recall the last time Tracy was with us and he talked about this, he talked about it from the fiscal efficiencies. And the collateral impact happened to be that it would meet some of those goals around the later start time. So that's how we got into this.
The one thing we want...
Because I think the one thing that, if you sit in the transportation conference room, I think sometimes they feel like, and they should feel this way, because I think that we make decisions, 3 or 4 steps removed from them that they're quickly scrambling to get to. And they're a service provider, and they are trying to meet the needs of their customers. And so when we're trying to make good decisions on an educational level, this is what really sparked this. I think between the CTE and then when Mr. Kleinbell told me that the K-8 move, because of middle school start time and elementary start time, would require 12 to 14 more buses, I was like, well, that already just negates any cost efficiencies we do by combining 2 schools into one. So I think all those things kind of combined said, look, I think we need to really touch this a little closer to make sure that we are getting it right here.
I just want to be mindful that we're not letting transportation drive education.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean,
But they
Mr.
do.
Jordan has been in,
Every day.
it's,
The children to school every
Well,
day.
you're
No,
being
I-
literal. I'm
Yes,
being,
I get your point.
right, being figurative. And it's just like what I've said recently as we've had ongoing conversations about the CTE high school. Schools are built from the inside out. And so you look at the educational planning piece first. But when you go back and think about the several retreat conversations we've had around our specialty programs, and we talked about how do we maximize participation in those, transportation has come up in that every time.
Right.
And so to be able to effectively address our real estate as well as our programs, we certainly had to interface transportation with it.
okay. Is bus staggering a board decision?
School start times, I think, are a board decision. The staggers aren't.
Okay. So I think we just need to understand what our role is in all this, and I appreciate the information. Obviously, it's here for good reason. I absolutely, applaud that. But I think we also need to know as our role as a board, what is it that we need to decide upon, what's in our purview to even vote on versus what is part of the educational plan that we in turn will vote on, that
Right.
this is an unintended or intended consequence.
I believe, and I need to check policy to be sure, but the school start times are pretty much policy. And which schools we put in that, in each of those staggers and how we affect that becomes an administrative function. But again, we don't want to do that, the board to be blindsided or
Right.
see that as a separate idea. But it would be the school start time vote that's required by our board, along with any boundary changes and pathway changes.
Okay. And then Tracy, I do appreciate too the idea that you and the team are talking about in terms of the community conversations, because I think those are going to be critical. There's a lot that we are going to be sharing with the community, and I do think you're right. If we throw, the kitchen sink at the community, that might be very challenging. So that's going to be very, yeah, we have to be very careful about how we ask community for feedback and what we're asking them for at what moment in time that they're able to absorb and make a good, reasonable decision.
Dr. Robinson?
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so flip about being literal, but they do, because they have to provide the children at the school to be able to be educated.
Yeah.
Somewhere on some golf course somewhere, Dr. Warren Stewart is smiling because he's been talking about a comprehensive master facilities plan since
Milestones.
my first day, milestone since my first day on the board. And
Start times was one of them.
this is part of that comprehensive plan. It made sense. When Dr. Gabriel and Ms. Basine advocated for the early start time for the high schools, for the
Later
secondary
start.
students, later start times, excuse me. I was concerned about how it would affect transportation costs, because in some districts it has driven it up. But based upon our requirements and our circumstances, it seems like there's going to be sufficient cost savings. And if we can keep a kid from having to get on a bus at 5:30 in the morning, that's a good thing. I like the out of the box thinking about the
Lighting.
the temporary lighting versus permanent lighting. I guess future boards could look at seeing about, for community activities and things like that, increasing that along the road. But again, we have limited resources, and we've got to, as representatives to the taxpayer, we need to make sure that we are utilizing the tax dollars as efficiently, as effectively as possible. And I'm excited about the June 6th meeting and look forward to the conversations that it possesses.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback on Dr. Robinson for a second, as well as something that Mrs. Doyle mentioned. So, I still look at all this in the context of the strategic planning process that we've been engaged in that began with the board and the community coming together and putting forward some innovations and expectations for the school division. So just as Dr. Robinson was saying, when you go back and think about the conversations that we did have about the master milestones, the work that we have been doing with DeJean Richter and their cooperative strategies, and the conversations with the specialty programs and the CTE school, all those things now, we're seeing how those dominoes
Are
line
lining
up.
up.
I think one of the things we need to look at with the community engagement piece is refocusing our efforts around that robust steering committee, the work that we have with the citizens there as part of that, and helping to be ambassadors and explaining this work. And the other thing is, I think it's important for us to tie it into the work that not only we've been doing here, but with the city is talking about lifelong learning and the future workforce and so forth. All these things fit into this innovative city that we say we want to be. And I think if we can find ways of couching it and positioning it that way, not just focused on bus routes and other things, I think that provides, at least could provide, some of the excitement and momentum, and frankly, helping some of our pride about the work that we're doing in the division and in the city as a whole. Now, I do have one question, one technical question, looking at the bus piece. And I don't know if this is Mr. Footy or who may answer this.
Page says benefits, which page?
Well, I'm just looking at the number of buses that are associated by middle school. What is it that drives? You know, it kind of makes sense to me with Ruffner having a large walking community. Why, you know, they may have 7 buses, but what is it that drives the disparity between a Blair having 18 buses for its attendance zone versus a Northside that has 8? What's driving that?
I'll start, but you've already defined it. Where that school sits in the neighborhood and the walking opportunities for students in that neighborhood. That's the first thing. The second thing is the overall enrollment of a school. The North Side is a larger school, but it still has a very significant walking neighborhood associated with it. So there are a lot of students that are within the boundary for transportation that are able to walk to the school. Then the other thing deals with what a school's specialty program may be. Now, we know we have not provided transportation for Blair's specialty program. Northside does not have a specific one, but you will recall that Blair's attendance zone spread out a lot more once Lafayette Winona was closed. So you had more students who were eligible for transportation than some of the other middle schools for that purpose. And I don't know, Mr. Foote.
Well, I would just ask, just in terms of, as you continue to look at that, because, for example, I hear from parents often in the Norview middle attendance zone that there are a significant number of walkers who are coming across the highway walkway. And so, you know, to the extent that we have walking schools that are close by, and so that's driving it versus decisions that we've made transportation-wise that may be driving some of the walking as well. And
I'm not debating.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
board's policy on what the walking distance is what sets
Yeah, I understand.
how that goes. And certainly administration recommends around that. And, you know, we've had very robust conversations this year over the Hampton Boulevard piece.
Right.
And
The
I
safety
still
issue.
stand by the decision that while there's some families who would desire their children to walk, I can't live with putting walkers crossing Hampton Boulevard, one of our business corridors in the street, in the city. So some of that comes into play. We actually learned about one area that hadn't, and there was a long debate this winter during one of our snowstorms whose property it was for rights or something that hadn't been cleared for snow when you talked about the Norview middle piece. And so we had to spend a lot of time seeing who was responsible for clearing that so that we could get schools reopened. And then there are concerns that occur over time as neighborhoods shift. And there's some parents say, well, I'm concerned about my child having to walk this distance or through this area because of things in the neighborhood. And so there are times when we have to revisit what makes sense about it. And I don't know, Dennis, you have...
And I'm with all that. I'm just saying it just caught my attention. And so
Yeah.
to the extent that you all are doing an examination assessment of that, it might be a good opportunity to also go back and review some of these concerns that we've had from parents in different pockets around that very issue. That was my only
To
point.
specifically answer your questions, I just put some of the numbers together based on what Mr. Kleinbill responded in terms of the numbers and did some formatting. So Mr. Kleinbill would need to respond to specifically to your question about, bus routes with a particular school.
Yeah.
But yeah, to answer your question, that's what Tracy's going to talk about, a little deeper dive and a little more information forthcoming.
Dr. Robbins.
And certainly these numbers will change as new enrollment comes in, those kind of things. So, and as we start to implement, if we can get to an implementation of what I might call cleaner feeder patterns.
This will allow us to revisit one issue that we weren't able to implement, and that's the implementation of the kids that have to walk to Ruffner, Booker T when it's raining out because it
Exactly.
floods. We couldn't,
Right.
we didn't have the money for it. Now
Right.
this will create the cost efficiency that
Right.
maybe we can provide that.
That's what I would, right, absolutely.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like it's a need,
Yes.
and to find the resources for it that's a good thing.
I'm impressed by the analysis. So, anything additional, Tracy? Questions, comments, next steps? We know we have the meeting coming up in June. But anything else you'd like to add or share with us at this time?
I think all the comments are certainly appreciated. Specifically looking at what the messaging for this process is really about, and what the board could vote on, and likely high school start time is probably this, but it just has such a domino effect. And actually I hadn't thought about it from that perspective about board policy on that, so I appreciate that and how to focus my conversation to you on that. And certainly the appreciation on the temporary lights thing, because I'm still a guy who thinks Wrigley Field should have temporary lights and not permanent. So that was my idea. Big on that. All right. So good. Again, I appreciate the feedback on that. Good.
All right.
We ready to move on?
Oh, you have more?
Well, you know what? I think we've kind of whet the appetite enough for June 6th, Tracy.
Oh, come on, he's got something. Don't hold back on us.
No, I mean, really, I mean, because
when you make a sale,
big
make
part
a
about it
sale.
is what to expect next time, and that's a draft master facilities plan.
Yep.
This was a piece that was related to it, but not in,
Yeah, I mean, it's 6:35, so I just didn't know if
we
there's, we can just go ahead and transition,
Yeah.
prepare to transition to our business meeting.
Now, it says a vote's required for the later start time. Is that?
That's just on the resolution.
that's the
that-
resolution
Okay.
in the consent
Okay.
agenda.
Okay. All right.
All right, so we'll consider that a wrap. Thank you, Mr. Richter, and thank you to the IT team for making this happen. We greatly appreciate your support, and Dr. Bailey and your crew. So, Dr. Boone, anything else before we adjourn this portion?
No, we're all good.
All right, so we'll consider this portion adjourned, and then we will reconvene at 7 o'clock in the boardroom for our business meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.